If everyone's ready, let's begin. A constitution of government once changed from freedom can never be restored. Liberty, once lost, is lost forever. When the people once surrender their share of the legislature and their right of defending the limitations upon the government and of resisting every encroachment upon them, they can never regain it. These words of John Adams compel me to affirm. Resolved, public colleges and universities in the United States ought not restrict any constitutionally protected speech. The value of highest importance in today's debate should be justice, defined as to each his due. Today we are here to analyze the obligations of public colleges and universities, thus concerning justice. To achieve justice, we should look to the idea of fulfilling institutional obligations. It is important for institutions to fulfill their obligations for two reasons. First, every institution in society serves a specific function. It is from this function that we derive the obligation of a specific institution. Institutions ought to live up to the purposes for which they were created. Second, institutions such as colleges have both explicit and implicit contracts with their constituents, which frame their institutional obligations. Because justice demands a fulfillment of contractual agreements, it follows that institutions ought to fulfill their obligations. However, contractual and institutional obligations are only legitimate if they are created freely and do not constrain the liberty of people without their consent. Likewise, it would also be illegitimate for institutions to overreach the authority originally bestowed upon them. Therefore, the best way to determine which side is better upholding justice in today's debate is to look to see which side better upholds institutional obligations. To clarify our discussion today, it is important to note that the resolution asks us to determine whether or not public colleges should be constrained by the Constitution in deciding whether they sanction certain kinds of speech on their campuses. Thus, the burden of the negative is not just to show the efficacy of speech codes or things like this, but to specifically address why public colleges should not be constrained by the Constitution. I offer three contentions. I first contend that the Constitution of the United States provides an important check on government institutions that should be respected at all times. As citizens of the United States government, we reasonably believe that the binding document of this nation should be respected, no matter which arm of the government we interact with. We also understand that specific institutions have specific purposes. For example, public schools are generally here to educate, but we must recognize that working to achieve institutional purposes, like education, is restricted in its scope by the Constitution. The Supreme Court famously wrote in their 1969 decision, Tinker v. Des Moines, quote, "It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate," end quote. In other words, just because an institution serves a purpose does not mean that it can ignore constitutional dictates with impunity. Rather, it is at the core of the American Constitution that no matter the governmental endeavor, government has an obligation to respect its limits. For example, the police serve the purpose of stopping and fighting crime. Undoubtedly, the police could work more efficiently if we remove the constraints of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. But we recognize the presiding institutional obligation of police municipalities to remain constitutional, even in their pursuit of fighting crime. Public colleges and universities are created through the power of the government and with the consent of the people. Therefore, colleges and universities ought to respect the system by which they originated and fulfill their primary obligation to act constitutionally. Next, I contend that restricting constitutionally protected speech violates the Constitution and thus undermines a critical obligation of colleges and universities. Our constitutional tradition prohibits the government from restricting speech on the basis of content. This idea of neutrality is clearly violated when colleges choose to restrict certain viewpoints. The Supreme Court writes in Rosenberger v. University of Virginia, quote, "For the university, by regulation, to cast disapproval on particular viewpoints of its students risks the suppression of free speech and creative inquiry in one of the vital centers for the nation's intellectual life, its colleges and university campuses," unquote. It follows, therefore, that restricting speech that is protected under the First Amendment is a clear violation of the Constitution. These constitutional violations are exacerbated since college officials are the ones committing them. It is a complete and total miscarriage of justice for unelected bureaucrats, such as these college officials, whose power can go largely unchecked, to commit such violations. And finally, I contend that public colleges and universities can take constitutional measures in order to promote an inclusive learning environment. Implementing speech restrictions against constitutionally protected speech is not the only way to combat campus racism. At the University of Missouri, when race tensions were high, students protested for change and they got it. The New York Times describes these changes as, quote, including hiring a diversity, inclusion, and equity officer for the entire University of Missouri system. The university will also provide additional support to students, faculty, and staff members who experience discrimination, create a task force to create plans for improving diversity and inclusion, and require diversity and inclusion training for all faculty, staff members, and incoming students. These are decisions that college officials may legitimately make for the sake of education. But for colleges and universities to unilaterally make the decision to implement unconstitutional policies is to usurp the authority that properly belongs to Congress and to the courts, and thus to defy and subvert our constitutional system. Thank you.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
So when do we say that an institution has failed to fulfill its obligation?
What do you mean?
Like, when would we, under your framework, determine that an institution has an obligation and has failed to meet it?
So I guess when I'm looking at institutional obligations, I
Right,
think we
yeah.
draw that from the purpose of the institution and why it was created in the first place.
So when would we say that an institution has failed to fulfill its purpose? Like, if some people are not receiving...
What do you mean?
So, like, if an institution is fulfilling its purpose in some cases but not others...
So the institution should do what it can in order to achieve that institutional obligation.
Right,
In this
but-
case, first and foremost is the Constitution.
Sure.
That's something that's pretty clear and defined.
Okay, but does the institution need to fulfill its obligation in respect to everybody with which it works, or is it okay to just say we're fulfilling our obligations
So let's
in
get
some
an
cases?
example here, because you seem to be begging for some kind of
I mean,
example.
no, I'm just asking when we determine whether your framework is being achieved or not.
So again, what I'm saying is in this instance, we're looking at public colleges and universities. And so the first and foremost obligation of them, I'm telling you, is to abide by the Constitution.
Okay, let's talk about
That's
that.
pretty clear and concrete.
So in what cases is it okay to not follow the Constitution?
Are we talking about a public institution?
Yeah.
Never.
So it's never okay to regulate with the Constitution and its applications.
What do you mean by that?
So it's never okay to do something that goes against the Constitution.
Public institutions should not violate the Constitution.
Okay, but so any of the amendments, any of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, for example, public institutions must uphold.
So let's understand that when I say Constitution, I'm not referring just to the original Constitution or the original 10 amendments. I'm
Right.
referring to the constitutional system at large. So with the whole body of constitutional law that has been passed and all of the precedents that have been set, this allows for a lot of leeway with many institutions.
Okay, let's talk about guns, for example.
Let's
So,
talk about guns.
constitutionally protected right to bear arms, right?
Right.
That's the ability to carry a gun around with you, correct? So if I can't bring a gun somewhere, does that mean my constitutionally protected right to bear arms is being infringed upon?
As it's written in the Second Amendment, but then we have this whole body of case law that actually clarifies that in some places you actually can be limited in your ability to.
would that not still be a restriction of constitutional rights? Wouldn't that just
Oh,
be a
no, not at all, because the Supreme Court or a constitutional court has declared that that is not
Okay, so, but-
unconstitutional
no,
for
but
public institutions to
Why
restrict
does that
your use of
mean?
handguns
Why does that
on a
mean the
public institution.
constitutional rights aren't being limited? If my
Because
constitutional
we're not just talking about the rights that are outlined in the 10 amendments, we're talking about the constitutional system at large. The Supreme Court issues decisions, and those decisions are the law of the
so
land.
schools don't restrict constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights.
What do you mean?
So schools don't restrict the Second Amendment rights.
I mean, I think a public college should restrict my right to
I agree
carry a
with that,
firearm.
but they
and I
still
think
do
that
that.
in DC v.
They-
Heller, the
they're-
Supreme Court
I
ruled that
I
you are
understand.
allowed to
I agree
constitutionally
I agree with
restrict
that, but so they still are restricting your constitutional rights, correct?
Not according to the Supreme Court.
All right, that's fine. Let's talk about your contention 3. So you're saying that there are better alternatives to speech codes, basically.
Constitutional alternatives.
All right, that's fine. Everyone's ready? I negate the resolution and agree to the value of justice. The value criterion, however, is promoting equal rights, because as Isaac Applebaum explains, in order to achieve justice, we must recognize that each person deserves their dues. All people have an inherent desire to have their rights protected, and we must thus consider the rights of all. If the rights of some people are being used to oppress those of others, we apply restrictions to maintain equal balances of rights and equal balances of dues. Furthermore, each branch and agency of government has specific obligations and rights to protect. The obligation of a university, besides ensuring basic necessities for its students, is providing an education equally to all. Finally, according to the Department of Education in Title 20, the term constitutionally protected speech for institutions of higher education refers to that under the First and 14th Amendments. This debate is about whether colleges and universities ought to be able to regulate speech beyond that the government restricts in a park or in the streets. My first contention is protecting equal access to education. Things like hate speech and racial slurs are detrimental on college campuses. Deborah Schwartz of Case Western writes that race relations have become one of the most common concerns among university students. Additionally, she finds, while racial harassment increases, the percentage of minorities enrolled in universities is also decreasing. And Andre Perry writes in the Washington Post that minority students who experience hostile environments have 11% lower GPAs and drop out earlier than those who are comfortable learning. Students who had welcoming environments were twice as likely to agree that their college and university prepared them for the real world than those who were uncomfortable. And Richard Delgado writes in the Harvard Law Review that hate speech also causes psychological harms, like isolation, self-hatred, and even mental illness. He continues that more speech is frequently useless because it may only provoke further abuse, or because the insulter is often in a position of power over the victim. Victims of hate speech, he writes, must be able to institute legal or procedural action, thereby relieving the sense of helplessness that leads to psychological harms, and communicating to the perpetrator and to societies around them that such abuse will not be tolerated. Schwartz concludes that schools must act to attract and keep minorities on campus. Racist epithets breed racial tensions, thwart goals of diversity, perpetuate stigma, alienate individuals, and segregate the community. Each racist incident contributes to an environment where minorities feel excluded and cannot perform as academic or social equals. As minorities withdraw from the student body, the entire community suffers from the loss of their unique potential. So in order for all students to be able to learn and be given what they deserve from a college, marginalized groups need extra protections from hateful and destructive comments. Contention 2. Hate speech promotes hate violence. Hate speech, even if it seems peaceful at first, can fuel hateful atmospheres on campuses, which makes violence more likely. Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL writes that prejudice, discrimination, and dehumanization all contribute to an atmosphere where hate becomes commonplace and prejudice becomes the norm. Rhetorical excess, thus, gives rise to a climate in which prejudice and hate-fueled violence can take root. He concludes that reasonable people can differ, but stereotypes, slurs, and insults have no place in discourse. Furthermore, confirmation of hateful views increases the probability of hate-motivated violence, as potential offenders become more encouraged as they witness more and more people supporting their hateful ideologies. Thus, McAdams U. Chicago finds that the strongest empirical support thus implies that raising the costs of engaging in hate speech will deter hate crimes. Finally, Mullen and Smith found that hateful speech towards minority ethnic groups causes increased suicide rates among them. So therefore, since the type of speech clearly does not belong on a place of education, I negate. Moving on to my opponent's case. So he establishes this idea of promoting institutional obligations, where institutions have to fulfill the obligations they are prescribed. There are two problems with looking at this subjectively. So the first of all is that he talks about in his own framework this idea of contracts. Recognize when you sign up for a college, you are signing a contract. You agree that in order to receive an education, you acknowledge the rights of others to obtain education as well. Just as you give up your Second Amendment rights when you go to college, you also ought to be able to give up some rights in order to achieve this education that you're signing up for. Others can do the same. We aren't imposing, in my world, just these speech codes on people where they can't speak. It is their choice to enroll in the school, and they therefore agree through a contract to this giving up of rights. But then second of all, if we want an institution to fulfill its obligation, it must fulfill its obligations to all people. We wouldn't say a police force is effective if it only helps white people but not anybody else. At that point, even if we think the institution is still functioning, it must also be functioning in respect to helping all of the people that are supposed to be helped by it. At that point, if minorities are dropping out of school, contemplating suicide, getting lower grades, clearly the obligations are not being fulfilled. But let's go to my opponent's first contention about how the Constitution must always be respected. Again, there are a few problems with this. The first of all, we can't just blindly follow the Constitution. We must remember things like slavery were permitted, but African Americans were considered to be 3/5 of a person under the Constitution. At that point, I agree, the Constitution is a very important document, but we can't just look blindly to it and take all our actions based off of it. We ought to have the Constitution reflect our values of justice rather than the other way around. But then, secondly, recognize the only way to actually have the Supreme Court review the Constitution is to have a case brought to it in the first place. A Supreme Court isn't going to just suddenly determine, hey, let's review hate speech on college campuses, unless there is a college case that is brought to it in the first place. So thus, only in the negative world do we actually have the opportunity to have meaningful change at the national court level. Then on the second contention about how it violates the Constitution, this is a very important issue in today's round. Remember the definition of constitutionally protected free speech according to Title 20. It is the First and 14th Amendments. There is a way to constitutionally regulate constitutionally protected rights, but you still are regulating constitutional rights. When you don't have your Second Amendment rights, you still don't have your Second Amendment rights, regardless of whether or not doing so is constitutional. So yes, I agree, we ought to try maybe to do things constitutionally. That does not mean that we are voting affirmative. The affirmative doesn't say that since we are regulating constitutional protected free speech, it's unconstitutional. There are constitutional ways. In fact, in Healy v. James, the court ruled that if speech were to destroy the function of a university, as I have proved it is, that would be constitutional to regulate then. But finally, on his final contention about kind of constitutional measures, none of these are going to be as effective as a speech code. We don't just tell murderers, murder is bad, don't do it. We have laws against it too. So I agree, all of these things are very good, but they're not exclusive, they're not mutually exclusive with speech code. Let's have officers, let's have speech codes, let's have justice in every way possible.
Is everyone ready? All right, let's begin. So if the Supreme Court rules that, let's say, fighting words are no longer constitutionally protected, are fighting words constitutionally protected by the
No.
First Amendment?
No.
Why not?
Because the Supreme Court said they're not.
Okay.
But if the
So
Supreme,
it's
wait,
not just about what's written in the First Amendment,
no,
but the
it
Supreme
is.
Court's
If the
interpretation
Supreme
of it.
Court were to say fighting words aren't allowed or can be constitutionally regulated, for example, in a school, it still will be constitutionally protected speech. The Supreme Court has said the First Amendment.
So if the Supreme Court says it's constitutional for a government institution to regulate one's use of certain words in a certain place in the government, you're arguing that that's still protected.
Right. So fighting words aren't constitutional because the Supreme Court has said they aren't under the First Amendment.
Okay.
That's what defines
all right,
constitutionality.
So let's talk about something else. So you basically argue in your contention that, well, we need equal access to speech and to education, basically.
Right.
So would you say that the sole role of a public institution like a public college is to educate?
I would say that's the first and foremost.
Okay.
role.
So why do they have the right to disobey the Constitution?
I'm not saying they should just disobey whenever they find fit. I'm just saying that if they're trying to promote
But
education.
is there ever a time where a public institution should disobey the Constitution?
Yes,
Why?
because I explained that in this case, first of all, to revise the Constitution, we must have a case brought to it in the first
Okay,
place.
so we disobey the Constitution so that we can have a lawsuit against the government institution so we can change the Constitution.
The Underground Railroad is unconstitutional. There are times when the Constitution is not perfect, and I think we ought to look past that.
So why do we have to violate the Constitution to change it? Don't we have a process for that already in place?
Well, I think first of all, we should be changing it, and we should make sure we also do that which we think is good.
Right.
So,
And
like,
so wait. So I'm asking you, why is it true that the only way to change the Constitution is by violating it? Answer that.
Okay, that's if you want to get it to the Supreme Court, there has to be a case about it. You can't have a case.
Okay, and
on
there's no
free
other
speech.
process that we can change the Constitution by?
You can go to the Senate, but obviously nothing is being done, and there are still these problems among minorities. So I would say we could stand there and twiddle our fingers and say maybe in the future
Okay,
they'll
so,
help minorities, but they're
let's
not.
ask a different question. So
All right.
you talk about equal rights, right?
Right.
How is it equal for a government institution to actually target one group of people who hold a certain
They're
kind
not
of view?
targeting your view. They're just saying you can't express ideas that.
Okay,
would
so
hurt.
they're saying that because I have a view, I can't express it, but they're not targeting my
If
view.
my view was to express fighting words, then I can't express that view either, right? Like if your
Right,
view.
because that's been determined as constitutionally
Well,
not
I mean,
protected. So I'm
you-
asking you this question. Why is it legitimate, and why does it uphold this idea of equal rights for a government institution to actively pursue and limit the views of a certain group of people?
So the first reason is that they are consenting to this when they sign up for college in the first place. We are not just having the government target you and say
So,
you can't say
let's
this.
talk about this. So when I consent to college, can they do whatever they want to me?
No, you sign what they can do to you.
Okay, so what do you mean I signed that? Because
Like,
I never
wait-
signed anything, and I've signed
Okay,
up for
well,
college.
You
already.
haven't like officially enrolled in it yet, then anyway. But,
Okay.
like,
All right, thank you. Everyone ready? Let's begin with the negative. So my opponent offers this idea that we should promote equal rights. I think rights are a good thing. I think equal rights are also a good thing. But I just want to point out that the negative isn't actually doing that. What the negative is doing, what my opponent is doing, is he's advocating for policies on colleges that target a certain group of people. Now, in his perception, it's okay this time because that group of people holds bad opinions. They are racist. They think affirmative action is bad. But when we apply this idea to other things, it could be actually applied to the minorities he's actually trying to protect. Because when we allow ourselves to say, no, government institutions can sometimes violate the Constitution, like he proposes, what we're doing is we're saying whenever the government finds that it'd be beneficial or convenient to just go against their constitutional dictates, they should do so, or they can do so. This is really scary. Let's go to his contentions. His first contention talks about how we need equal access to education. Now, I think that equal access to education is important, and a public institution like a college should never implement a policy that is going to actively discriminate against any one member of their college. But so far as I'm concerned, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about that college implementing policies that kind of restricts the way in which students interact with each other. And this is fundamentally an issue. So he brings up this one argument from the Washington Post about how, well, we need to have these policies because, minority students are going to drop out more. They have lower GPAs. Well, he doesn't actually ever reply to the example I give on my side, where I show you that we can have constitutional measures to solve for these issues. And he asserts that, well, those aren't as effective, but at the University of Missouri, they were effective. In fact, before the biggest issue at the University of Missouri, they in fact had speech codes, and they weren't working. So what we can see is that it's unnecessary for governmental institutions to impose unconstitutional measures. So he has to stand up here and not just say why restricting hate speech is a good idea, like I said in my case. He has to explicitly say why having colleges do unconstitutional things is okay and justified. He hasn't done that here. Contention 2, he talks about how hate speech promotes hate violence. Well, this is an absurd argument, to be honest, because what he's doing is he's saying, well, mean things, saying mean things, having an atmosphere of meanness is going to cause people to do more violent things. He has no actual evidence of this, first of all, and this is also a really scary line of thought, because what it does, again, is it says, well, there's this thing that might cause violence in the future, so let's just limit it now. This is a government that has now become overbearing and is too restrictive and is not following the Constitution. That's a big issue. So in the affirmative world, violence would still be illegal. We would not allow hate crimes to exist. We just wouldn't preemptively restrict rights to try and stop them. So let's go to the affirmative side. His response against my idea of fulfilling institutional obligations is, well, you make a contract with the college. Well, this is flawed for a couple reasons. First of all, I don't just give away all of my rights to the college when I sign up to go there, like he is advocating for. The government, no matter what it does, this is the purpose of the Constitution. No matter what arm of the government we interact with, we have a contract, we have an expectation that they're going to respect the Constitution. This is something he fundamentally misses. So on the first contention, he says, we shouldn't just blindly follow the Constitution. We're not blindly following the Constitution. He brings up slavery. Yeah, we use the constitutional process to solve for slavery. It's called the 13th Amendment. So we can do the same here. We can use things like amendments or the Supreme Court to change the way that our Constitution functions. But that's a discussion for the federal courthouse down the street, not here. So when he talks about how, well, basically we need to regulate rights, we're not actually violating rights, we are. Because the Supreme Court has ruled, if they've ruled that these types of speech are protected, it is unconstitutional for a government institution to restrict them, even if it's just on a public college campus. This is a big issue. So lastly, against my third contention, he just says they're not as effective. These constitutional methods aren't as effective. Well, that's not a legitimate argument because he has no evidence. He hasn't actually responded to my example. So for these reasons, I continue to affirm.
I'll be defending my case and addressing my opponents. Everyone's ready? The first contention my opponent makes, he never responds to the evidence I provide from Title 20 that explains when we're debating what constitutionally protected speech is, we're not looking to what Supreme Courts have said as to how it applies. We're looking at the First Amendment itself. When the Supreme Court rules that certain speech, like fighting words, is unconstitutional, that is unconstitutional. But when they rule that certain types of speech can be restricted in some areas, those rights are still constitutional rights. All the Supreme Court is saying is they can be constitutionally regulated in certain areas. At that point, this idea of hate speech is still constitutional according to Title 20. But just even though the Supreme Court has ruled, as in the Healy v. James case, that they are allowed to regulate this speech if it causes a substantial harm to their campus, does not mean it is no longer constitutionally protected. When you can't bring your gun to a public building, that's still a constitutional violation of your rights. All it is it's a constitutional restriction of constitutional rights. Those can exist. But my opponent's attack on my framework is that I'm not protecting equal rights because I'm targeting certain people. He doesn't actually respond to the analysis I present. It is that when some people are able to use their rights to oppress those of others, that is only applied restrictions. I'm not just saying that we're going to target some people and help others. I'm just saying that those people who are in a position where they can abuse their rights if they so choose should not be given that power. We shouldn't give some students the able to dominate others, force them out of school, make them contemplate suicide just because of their race. But on the first contention about equal access to education, my opponent's first argument is that we're restricting how students interact. That's a bad thing. He doesn't explain why it's a bad thing. When I say murder is illegal, I'm restricting how people can interact. I would still say laws against murder are perfectly good. But then he also talks about how I don't respond to his example from Missouri. The problem is I did explain why that was not sufficient, because yes, I agree. We ought to have these officers that promote diversity. We ought to support minorities in college campuses. But we can't just rely on that. You can't rely on attempting to help people. You must also have legal recourse. And that's very important because you never respond to the evidence that Delgado of Harvard presents. And that is that just saying things is never sufficient. You have to have procedural recourse. You can't just say that murder is bad and stop murders. You have to also have laws against murder. So yes, in the negative world, we can target this problem from both sides. We can try and stop it from happening in the first place, but also have laws to make sure even if something is about to happen, we can act to stop it. But on contention 2 about violence, he talks about how meanness doesn't lead to violence. I don't give you any evidence. That's fine. According to Hans-Diep Singh of the ICAED, hate crimes against the LGBT community have risen 36% due to the anti-marriage equality movement. At that point, there is substantial evidence there. But he never responds to the actual logical reasoning, and that is, as more and more people start saying hateful views, if you now have an atmosphere where that hate becomes the commonplace and becomes the norm, that's going to therefore lead to the mistreatment of those students. If I were to say, oh, Mexicans are all terrorists, well, if my friends start saying that and everybody starts saying that, we now have an atmosphere where Mexicans are frowned upon, where Mexicans being shunned is considered a good thing and a common thing. That's what enables the violence. But he never responds to the argument about suicides at all. I would say if colleges are allowing people to even contemplate suicide, something unjust is going on. Let's go on to my opponent's side of the case. So he talks about how we don't just give away all our rights to these colleges. And I agree, we don't give up all of our rights, but we do waive certain rights. When you sign up to a 10-day school, you waive certain rights. Whenever you sign up to do something that is related to an institution, that institution is allowed to waive some of your rights. You agreed to that by even attending the school in the first place. At that point, you never respond to the argument that insofar as these people are going to be agreeing to go to the school, they're going to be aware of the speech code policies, and they are therefore, since they're going to the school, agreeing to give up some of their rights. It's not unconstitutional at all. But then he talks about how the constitutional process solved the problem of slavery. Yes, it did, but it took a few decades, and I would say that we should not have frowned upon the Underground Railroad for violating the Constitution. We could have, yes, done so constitutionally, but we should not just follow the Constitution in the several years it takes to revise it. But on contention 2, the first thing he never responds to is this evidence from Healy v. James. He's conceding the argument that we can actually regulate constitutional rights constitutionally, because Healy v. James explains that if there is something in the First Amendment that so substantially destroys the purpose of a university, that is education, it is okay to restrict it. At that point, we are seeing that insofar as my arguments are being conceded, clearly hate speech is harming disability. It's not fulfilling its institutional obligation. But then, secondly, he never responds to the argument that you must have at least a challenge on this issue to have it go to the Supreme Court. If we want even the Supreme Court to revise its rulings or come to a new interpretation, it's not going to do so overnight. There has to be a case brought to it. That only happens if universities take the initiative to actually start pushing the limits. But then on his contention 3, talks about how it just is not a legitimate argument. Well, that's a fine assertion, but I explained very logically why it's a very legitimate argument, and that is you don't just say murder is bad and then be done with it. You also have to have procedural action against it. I agree. Student officers, diversity officers, supporting minorities is a very good thing to do, but I would also argue we should have that and these legal procedural norms and these speech codes. Let's go to key voting issues. The first voting issue is going to be the harms of hate speech. This is the cleanest place to vote negative in today's round because he's conceding the first of all, unequal education, and second of all, the suicide rates. At that point, clearly some students aren't being given their obligation that the institution owes to them. Again, we can't just look to institutional obligations in the abstract. They must pursue this obligation as it applies to all people. The second voting issue is we need a Supreme Court case to even happen if we want to revise the amendments in the first place and have to do interpretations. But the final key voting issue is Healy v. James, and that is you can constitutionally restrict constitutionally protected rights. My opponent never responds to this argument. Therefore, by that, even if we want to follow the Constitution as much as possible, we vote negative.
I'll just be boiling the debate down to 3 key points. Everyone ready? All right, let's begin. So the first key issue in this round is the framework and the framing of today's debate. So my opponent constantly talks about how there's this contract between colleges and students to have education. I agree that colleges should provide education, but we're talking about public colleges. We're talking about public universities. And like I said in my case, when we deal with public institutions, regardless of what they're trying to do, education, stopping crime, things like this, they have to be bound by the Constitution. That is not negotiable. So his argument is, well, wait. The negative isn't actually violating the Constitution, but it's okay if we sometimes violate the Constitution. See, this doesn't really make sense. His argument is, well, there was this case that came out and said, well, just because in some places we restrict speech, it doesn't mean it's wholly not constitutionally protected. But we're talking about public colleges. If the Supreme Court has ruled that it is constitutional for a college, a public one, to infringe on your right to say certain things at the college, that speech is no longer protected on that campus. I mean, that's just true. And so the negative is inherently being unconstitutional. And he kind of admits that during cross-ex. He says that, well, yeah, it's okay to sometimes violate the Constitution if we're trying to do better things. So we have to acknowledge that this debate is not just about, who's going to better show which world has less suicide and which side has, more enrollment by minority students in colleges. It's about the obligations of the government to abide by the Constitution. So with that, let's go to the second key issue in today's round. The second issue is that on the affirmative side, we can solve for many of the issues he brings up by acting constitutionally. He says that I never respond to his argument. Well, I did. What I'm saying is that by simply asserting, well, this isn't enough, that's not an actual argument. I'm showing you that at the University of Missouri, what happened was there were speech codes, they weren't effective, and what they did is they provided counseling, they provided all of these different initiatives that sought to stop all of the racial tensions on the campus. It wasn't just the administration saying, don't be racist. They were actually implementing policies, and these policies were constitutional, and that's really important. And the last issue and the most important issue of today's round is about constitutionality. I agree that hate speech is bad. I agree that when there's hate speech, there may be more suicide. There may be more college dropouts. But that doesn't grant the right to public universities to disobey the Constitution. That's the answer he's never provided us with. This debate is not whether or not speech codes are effective, whether or not hate speech is bad. This debate is fundamentally about whether or not a public institution, like a public college, should have the right to take extra constitutional measures. He has not provided sufficient evidence to show why that is the case, why they should be allowed to do this. And that is scary for me, because what he's saying is, well, if there is a social harm, suicide, racism, hate speech, the government no longer has to follow the Constitution. But the Constitution is there for those instances. The instances where government is trying to advance its own purpose, that's when the government most certainly has to be bound by the constraints of the Constitution. So for these reasons and more, I continue to affirm. Thank you.